and joining the Native News Online conversation with Perry Link. He is an academic and a scholar on China. Also joining us is Levi Rickert, and my name is Valerie Van de Pan. Levi is the publisher online, and I am the managing editor. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Perry for taking the time out today to join us and to talk with us about China, especially China's recent statement and very well researched article statement about the United States committing genocide against Native Americans. Can you talk a little bit about its significance or, you know, what that means?
The Communist Party of China cares most about its own power, meaning its control inside China mostly. And the herding of Uyghur people in the northwest of China into camps, labor camps, and subjecting them to persecution that wouldn't allow them to follow their Islam beliefs, making them swear allegiance to the Communist Party of China and to declare their Islam beliefs to be superstition and to give up their culture in a broader sense, even to the extent of having people from the Han majority move into Uyghur homes in order to monitor them and to help them transition from Uyghur culture into mainline Han culture, uh, requiring children in schools to speak Mandarin Chinese instead of their local languages, and even sterilizing women and requiring them not to have children that are Uyghur, forcing them to marry Han people in a cruel kind of uh, assimilation, forced assimilation. All of this started in the about 2017-18 and became known to the world in 2019 and is very embarrassing to the Communist Party of China. So they are desperate in a sense to try to balance the moral scorecard. And this is the reason for turning to the very sorry history of the Europeans coming to North America and annihilating Native American culture, because this, of course, is morally outrageous in the same sort of sense that they're doing, but they want to try to even the scorecard, as it were, by saying, you people have done just even worse things than you accuse us of doing. That, in essence, is the reason why they came out with this report. As you noted, it's a well-researched report, though. It relies on what the mainline culture in the West has done in order to research the sorry history of the repression of Native Americans. And it's full of facts. So that part mustn't be denied. In fact, it should be upheld. But the purpose of doing it is a selfish political reason inside China to try to keep control of the whole country, including the Uyghurs in the Northwest.
Yeah, and
Wow.
Professor Link, I was taken back by the accuracy of the report. Is there any coincidence with the timing with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, or is it just a coincidence?
The invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I think, is not directly related to this. Uh, the Communist Party of China wants it to be the dominant force in the world eventually, and sees Russia and Vladimir Putin as an ally along the way in order to do this. And right before the Winter Olympics, you probably know that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin met in Beijing at the opening ceremonies. and declared themselves to be partners in an anti-hegemonic effort to unseat the US as the main global power. So that's the basis on which the alliance between, not quite an alliance, but strong friendship between Putin and Xi Jinping is based, and it's still there. I think now Xi Jinping is in an awkward position because the rest of the world overwhelmingly, not entirely, but overwhelmingly has denounced what Putin is doing in Ukraine. And this makes it hard for the Chinese government to say that we support it. But on the other hand, they don't want to say we're opposed to Xi Jinping, to Putin as well. And so they're hamstrung right now.
Professor Link, I'm going to read a message we received after we published an article about China declaring that the United States committed genocide against Native Americans. And it was specifically in regards to the comments on the Uyghurs. And the writer says, I am French living in China. And when these accusations first came out, I wondered, do I want to live in a genocidal country? And so I read the Western media accounts of the alleged genocide and followed the links to the growing body of evidence. But I found the evidence to be lacking. For instance, the so-called satellite pictures of the camps used for mass internment of more than 1 million people actually show lights in the desert at night, which are assumed to be camps. And then this person goes on to basically say much of the evidence is false, ending with, I think it's telling that most of the countries that call China out on the issue are Western countries whose record with Muslims, including Uyghurs, are actually quite bad. The US killed many in Afghanistan just across the border from Xinjiang. But those were actual terrorists, right? So, and I think we've heard, anyone who has followed China or the Uyghur issue is familiar with the argument that they're not really internment camps, or they're just re-education camps, or especially from, I think, Westerners who are perhaps wealthy and see a different kind of China when they're there. What do you think about those remarks that there's not really a lot of evidence to what's happening with the Uyghurs?
Well, first of all, I don't want for a moment to be defending the Western world's general approach to what we call the third world or the non-Western world. There's a lot of sorry history involved there. But that doesn't come close, in my view, to, in a factual sense, saying that the repression of the Uyghurs in northwestern China is fake evidence or non-evidence. The evidence is really overwhelming. It's not just the satellite pictures that I would challenge the French friend here. I think that those pictures are very convincing. There are before and after photographs of where there used to be mosques, and now there's just a pile of rubble and so on. But the evidence goes far beyond that, because there are all kinds of interview evidences of people that have escaped from those camps and have come out and have told the story of how they were beaten and raped and they were torn apart from their families. And very credible evidence, people literally in tears that you can't imagine these people are faking the tears. And then there was this big expose in the New York Times in 2019, not only of evidence of what had happened, but of evidence, bureaucratic records of planning it. So there you had in black and white, page after page, records of how in Beijing, in the Communist Party of China, the engineering of the whole project to make camps, to put the label on them of these are re-education camps, but they're not. They're labor camps. And the products of the labor camps, T-shirts and other kinds of toys and technological devices have been traced to the production of the camps. There's several kinds of evidence, and the concatenation of them is just too much to sustain any kind of argument that the whole thing is faked.
Thank you for putting that into context. And I think you also pointed this out when we did our interview for the story, and in the story on China calling out our genocide, that the United States is very much recognizing and trying to reconcile with the past, even though many of the wrongs are ongoing and continue. But China is still kind of in this denial that anything is happening there. So, what is there to be done when you have two countries that have committed genocide, are committing genocide, but won't really admit it?
Well, I think you're correct to say that the main difference there is a time difference. If you go back 100, 150 years in our country, there was no acknowledgement of a genocide. You had a technologically more advanced culture coming in and just annihilating the other one, assimilating and killing, and just, we're right, you're wrong, we're advanced, you're backward. It was terribly one-sided and unfair. Even when I was a boy in the 1950s, my little friends and I would play. We had two kinds of games. One was cops and robbers, good guys and bad guys. The other was cowboys and Indians, and the Indians were the bad guys. This was in the 1950s. If you look at that ethic in the United States and compare it with today, and of course, it's not perfect today by a long shot, but the amount of progress that has been made in our country in recognizing the genocide of the Native Americans has been pretty remarkable. And in that sense, it hasn't even started in China. It's ongoing. It's still on the upswing to say the Uyghurs are backward and we're the more advanced and we need to assimilate them and we put them into labor camps and that doesn't matter. We're decades away, I'm afraid, in China of a recognition inside China that this was a genocide and that this was wrong. So I see the two phenomena as parallel, but one is farther along in a time sequence than the other.
And Professor, with the talk of critical race theory now in the United States, really promoted by the far right, what should we do to ensure history is accurately presented to our youth? And I as a Native American, I feel it's really important, but please give us your take.
Oh, well, I agree with you, of course. We, on these controversial issues, will always have far left, far right, far this, far that. In fact, I would put our French friend into that category there. He or she is probably in a certain very special kind of view of all of this. As an academic, my hope, in fact, I think it's our only hope, is just try to be factual. Try to look squarely at what happened. Human beings don't like to look squarely at ugly things that they have done. This is true of individual people. It's true of cultures. But we have to try. That's the only way out, to be as factual as we can and challenge ourselves to look at ugly things squarely. And I think both in the United States and in China, looking at problems like the Uyghur repression, in the long run, that's the only way out. Because if you try to cure one extremism by calling upon the cavalry of another kind of extremism, you're just going to generate more emotion. But in the long run, I hate to use the word objective, it's such a tough word, but we have to try. We have to try to be factual and honest, looking at what has happened, and then say what we discover, not be afraid to not say it.
It's very true. If you're just joining us, we're talking with Perry Link about China's recent statement that the United States committed a genocide. Professor Link is a scholar on China. where does this time frame go? So if the United States and China both committed genocide and have committed genocide, are committing genocide, but are at two different points in the timeline on how these things develop, what's next for the United States?
Next for the United States in looking at itself or looking at the world and trying to have an effect there are somewhat different questions. Looking at ourselves, I think we just need to keep going in the direction that we have been going in since the 1950s, when my little friends and I played cowboys and Indians, until today, when I, anyway, and many, I think, in the mainstream American culture feel genuinely remorseful about what our ancestors did. That's the right direction to go in, and we should keep going in it. As to the question of what we should do on this side of the ocean, looking at the parallel kind of repression of Uyghurs in China, there's a subtle question of culture A telling culture B what it ought to want. And I'm not in favor of that, honestly. I don't think as an American I should be telling Chinese people, Uyghurs or not Uyghurs, what they should want. That's their business. What I see my role as, and I have a lot of Chinese dissident friends, and I've worked in cooperating with human rights efforts for a long time. But my policy is to listen to what the people on the other side of the ocean say they want, and then do my best to support it. There are courageous dissident voices inside China who need to be translated, who need to have their messages spread in the West and analyzed and promoted. We have Elam Tofti, this wonderful Uyghur scholar, a moderate man and a professor who was arrested a decade ago or so and sentenced to life in prison in Xinjiang, in China. Even though he was more moderate, there's a question of why would a moderate voice be given such a heavy sentence? And I think the reason for that is precisely in order for the central government in China to be able to say, look, even being moderate on this question isn't going to be tolerated. We're going to take a moderate professor and put him in jail for life, just as a warning to everybody on the spectrum that you mustn't go that direction. So there you have this courageous man in prison. His daughter is out. She goes around the United States giving interviews and blogs and so on. And I support her, and I support him any way I can to get their message out. So I think that's what we should do. We should listen to people who are suffering and try to help them, but stand short of coming from our culture and saying, here's what you ought to want, because that's not our business. That's their business. Let them decide what they want, and then we support it.
Yeah, appreciate that respecting of sovereignty of another nation to kind of figure out their stuff. I like that. Again, if you're joining us, we're speaking with Perry Link. He is a scholar on China. When it comes to this statement, on a global scale, how significant is it? Will the UN take it seriously? Will the Hague take it seriously? What is the likelihood of it actually really truly having some international ramifications?
By it here, we mean the Uyghur genocide in China.
Oh, forgive me, but the statement that the United States committed a genocide against Native Americans.
I think that statement won't go very far. That's not to say it's not an accurate statement, but it was included in a Chinese embassy release a couple of weeks ago. And other than to hear about it from you, I haven't seen it in the news very much, and I'm not sure it will go very far. Of course, the Chinese government could bring it to The Hague and to the United Nations, and it might get some kind of treatment there, serious or pro forma, I'm not sure. But I don't read it as, and I think most of the geopolitical world out there won't read it as a legal document so much as a political statement, trying uh, to balance the moral scales when the United States accuses, or the Western world accuses China of this genocide, to say, no, look, you've got to do it. It's more the court of public opinion in a political sense that's at stake here.
Got it. Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to explain that to us. Is there anything you'd like to add or that you think our audience needs to understand or know about either the statement that the US committed genocide against Native Americans or the current genocide against the Uyghurs?
Well, just to note what we've already said, in a sense, that both of these events are horrible and they're one-sided, and they are from a position of so-called superiority, saying we're more advanced so we can annihilate you. All of that is similar. What's a bit different is that I think the genocide of the Native Americans was more sort of out of control. That is, we'll just go and shoot our way across the country. Not really planned, just sort of arrogant brashness, you might say. Whereas the Chinese government's repression of the Uyghurs is very well planned, and it has an economic component to it. They're exploiting the cheap labor of the people in the camps, and they have detailed plans about how they're going to take over, how they're going to assimilate, how they're going to force the Uyghur children to speak Mandarin in schools and so on. So there are similarities here and there are differences, but both are horrible, of course.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for putting it into context for us, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us and to share with our audience as well. We really appreciate you and your work, Professor Link.
Well, thank you for organizing this, Valerie. I'm a big admirer of what you're doing and trying to do here.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone watching us on Facebook and on social media channels. We really appreciate you too. Thank you all.
Okay.